Hi everyone, I'm Tina McIntyre, Florida Friendly Landscaping Agent at the UF-IFAS Extension in Seminole County. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Florida Friendly principle, attract wildlife. So we're going to cover a quick overview, and in the first part I'm going to talk about providing shelter, water, how to manage habitat, and then in the second part we're going to talk about providing food sources, fruit-bearing plants, and host and nectar plants. As a biologist, this topic is near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to kind of cover the attract wildlife. And this is just one of the 9 Florida-friendly principles. So as we rapidly urbanize, it's very important that we also think about the land that is lost in development. So, it could be a natural habitat, it might have been agricultural lands that are more supportive of wildlife, but urban areas with a lot of impervious surfaces, are just not really meant to support wildlife. And so we see a lot of kind of areas that just don't have what it takes to support these animals. And, so we have to look at supporting wildlife. So this is obviously, unlikely in at least Central Florida, maybe in North Florida, 1 or 2 days out of the year or so. But, these animals, they don't have a lot of food sources and they don't have a lot of resources that can sustain them in an urban matrix. And so negatives or neighborhoods can have a positive or negative impact or on wildlife and nearby wildlife habitats. And Florida's natural resources support our jobs and our economy. So you might say, well, why do I need to care about the wildlife? Well, it affects all of us and our pocketbooks. Basically, people come to Florida for our natural resources because we have, great bass fishing and beautiful coastlines and wonderful springs, and really birding and wildlife is a huge part of that. And so, it really does tie back to our economy as well. So looking a little bit deeper at Florida's resources, we're the 3rd most diverse wildlife population in the USA. So that's 35 species of salamanders, 39 species of frogs, 48 species of lizards, 45 species of snakes, 26 species of turtles, and 3 species of crocodilians. And of the snakes, a short majority of those are venomous. And so, a lot of those are non-venomous snake species, just to cover that. So here you can see pictured our lovely owl species. So some of the basics of creating habitat: we want to limit the amount of lawn. So turf really does not provide a lot to wildlife. We want to think about lots of shrubs and trees that are going to provide what wildlife is looking for. Plant a variety of flowering and fruiting plants. Use plants of varying height and create layers for shelter. Diverse areas attract wider variety of animals. We want to think about shelter and cover. So it's not all about what these animals eat, although that is a huge component. They need places to hide from predators. We need a water source for them. They have to be able to drink. They need shelter and cover to nest and raise their young, and then space, to just be able to exist. And different species have different spatial requirements. So a hawk is going to need a lot greater of a space and a range than, say, a sparrow. Animals only reside or forage in areas with appropriate habitats. They're hardwired to find areas that are appropriate for them. So for example, our endangered scrub jay, which is an endemic species here in Florida, means it's found nowhere else except for in the state of Florida. Our endemic scrub jay preferred scrubby habitat. And so you're not going to see it in a neighborhood. You're not going to see it at a bird feeder. It needs certain things. Cover. So planting vertical layers Thinking about, a natural ecosystem. How does a natural ecosystem um, view when you look at it? It has the little ground covers, the herbs, forbs, and mosses, and then you see some, maybe some shrubs and things like that, and then ultimately leading up to the canopy. Um, Thinking about seasonal cover. So some things lose their leaves, and we're going to want to have things that can provide cover, maybe year round for some species. A lot of our birds are migratory. They're coming here, just like our human snowbirds, for the winter to get out of the cold, and they want seasonal cover to exist. Brush piles are also great. So thinking about when you prune down your old shrubs and things like that, you want to leave those piles for them. And then here's a dead tree. It's a snag, we call that. And snags are a rebirth of life. And biology and ecosystems are great at recycling and taking things that at once were alive and now dead and building them into something new and alive again. And snags are a fantastic example of that, where they kind of support insects and birds and all kinds of roosting and things like that. So for those snags and brush piles, when trees die, want to consider leaving them in the landscape. If there's no threat to property or life, then that's a great candidate to leave it. Here you can see an osprey or eagle's nest roosting in there. And again, creating new life, creating babies, creating little chicks. And it's used for feeding and nesting, and woodpeckers go in there and they find their breakfast. Bird and bat houses, and then also with pollinators, so resources used primarily by bats and birds. And then nest boxes, so some birds won't, they're cavity dwelling animals, and so they need some kind of cavity to be able to procreate and spawn the next generation. For pollinators, there's a variety and diversity of everything from birds, butterflies, bees, insects. You want to include 3 or more flowering plant species that bloom each year, and plant nectar and host plants for those butterflies. So it's not all about the nectar, but we want the vegetative, leafy stage of the plant. So shown here, we can see parsley, and also fennel is a great host plant. So just thinking about our herb garden. And then milkweed. So they, really enjoy the leaves of passion flower, and a lot of our native plants are great host plants for those caterpillars. And we want to provide places for bees to nest as well. And when people think of bees, they think of honeybees, and they do create the hive. But a lot of our bees here in Florida, are native green bees and all kinds of different bee species, actually prefer to go into little cavities of wood, shown here at the bottom, or might be ground dwelling. And so I know mulch is a Florida friendly principle, and it is good to support our plants and prevent erosion. But having some open sand is actually really good for insects as well. There's a lot of insect activity that occurs on bare soil, and for example, bees could be one of those. Avoid pesticides when possible, and so we might be actually killing off some of our really beneficial insects that help create a stable ecosystem and replicate a stable ecosystem in our yard. So those are really important part of it. Ponds for butterflies. So thinking about, again, that water source that these animals, they can only sustain without water for so long. So they need little puddles to be able to take a drink. It gets really hot here in Florida, and so for them to persist, we need little water. Now, you want to be careful with the mosquitoes, of course. We don't want standing water that's been standing too long, and then you get mosquito larvae in there, and we're creating a health problem. But we do want to think about puddles and areas maybe of flowing water that we can maintain for these animals. Another way of providing water is, a small amount of water can aid many animals. The sound of running water, I know in the few times that I do run my irrigation, we get cardinals that will come and bathe in that irrigation water. So even something as simple as that, when it's really dry, they will find it. When we have here like a little pond, be careful stocking it with any high-priced fish because the raccoons might help themselves to lunch, as I've heard from some residents. But this is a really great area to kind of provide that water source. And then bird baths. So you can see here two blue jays actually look like they're fighting over this bird bath and territory. And this can be a really great thing for you and the family to enjoy. I know my little one has enjoyed, running over and seeing the birds and all the different animals coming to our yard. Birds prefer baths with textured bottoms. So, a lot of these really trendy ones can get really elaborate and really look beautiful, but is it practical? So, their claws are going to want something that they can tangibly grip to. So just think about that. Design puddling station for butterflies. So here's actually a little one that, again, is not going to be harmful in terms of fostering mosquitoes because they're looking for very shallow puddles that are really just, it's moist. It's not really like the inundated water that a mosquito would need. It's just really a very light amount of moist soil that they can come and utilize. Manage habitat. So we want to manage pets. Cats in particular are a huge degradation to wildlife and birds. I recommend keeping your pet and your cats inside. We're going to also talk about removing exotic invasive species, native vegetation, tolerance for unwanted animals. So as we invite animals into our yard, we want to reconsider what might be called a nuisance animal. And maybe something more of a spectacle. And we want to expand the habitat. So cats, again, can be responsible for killing hundreds, if not thousands of birds. And it says millions of birds in the USA. So it's really, they can kill birds. You see here, it's probably got a rabbit. They can harm gopher tortoises. Feral cats are a big problem, and with Florida Friendly, we don't want you to release exotic pets into the wild. And essentially, cats are not a native species. They are feral, which means that they were domesticated and then they're now back in the wild. We want to avoid feeding stray animals. So, a lot of people really, their heart goes out to these animals, but it is best for them to be in a home. That was our original domestic partnership with cats, is to have them in the house, as animals that help us, thrive emotionally and catch rodents that are in the house, not necessarily animals and birds that are outside of the house. And so if you're trying to foster that, you will notice the birds will be less readily reticent to come into your yard if there is a dog or cat in the yard. Remove invasive exotic species. So approximately 1.7 million acres of Florida's natural areas invaded by exotic plant species. That's a huge amount. And I have to think that number is actually greater now, as this PowerPoint is a little bit older. And so that could be aquatic vegetation shown here. It could be tree species. We have a frog. These are the Cuban tree, invasive Cuban tree frogs. Invasive pest plants destroy natural habitat and they compete. So I've seen actually our invasive lizards eating native species, and we just want to watch out with invasive species taking hold in our yard. Invasive exotic species in your yard can impact areas far beyond your yard if they're, transported and spread to your neighbors, or even a wild area right next adjacent to your property. Consider native vegetation. So Florida friendly is not exclusive to native vegetation, but we really do embrace it. And we want people to foster and cultivate native vegetation. It doesn't have to be entirely native, but native plants provide reliable sources of co-evolved food and nectar. And what I mean by that is for hundreds of thousands of years, animals and plants have co-evolved in this soil. And they're well adapted to our extreme climates. They're supportive of those life cycles. So I mentioned passion flower. You can see it here pictured. This supports directly the life cycle of this Gulf flitiary butterfly. And so, the caterpillars eat the leaves and they're able to go into the next stage of their life. It is truly right plant in the right place. Native vegetation, also part of managing weeds. So a weed is simply a plant that is in an unwanted area. So that plant in another area could be considered the right plant in the right place. Consider allowing certain weeds to grow to contribute to natural habitat. So this one pictured here, this is Biden's alba. Could be the bane of your existence or could be a pollinator habitat. If you live in an HOA, you might not be able to do it in the front yard, but it's great to consider having a little patch in the backyard that's going to, help pollinators. I know that this Biden's alba, when I've let it in my yard, it thrives with pollinators and all kinds of different species. Weeds have benefits and, they're there to support the life. Wild, wonderful plants. So here we have Coreopsis species, which is our native state wildflower. We have blanket flower. This is Gaillardia. Horse mint, also known as Monarda punctata. That's a great one. It's also called bee balm because it's a bee attractant. You get all kinds of really cool wasp species, bee species, going to the Monarda, and it has such a lovely smell as well. And then pokeweed, considered a weed, named a weed, but really a great pollinator plant. It has great flowers and fruits to support wildlife. Manage pests. So we want to reduce pesticide use utilizing integrative pest management. Integrative pest management is where we identify insects and we don't have what we call routine spraying. It starts with the right plant in the right place. And almost all wildlife species eat insects in some ways. And so you can see this here, armadillo is actually looking for grubs. And that's a really important part of sustaining them. Even bears, they actually eat grubs a lot. And so thinking about allowing some insect tolerance in your yard. And that brings me to tolerance for unwanted wildlife. We want to understand why animals are present. So here you can see with the white under area, this is just simply our black house snake. So this is just a black racer. It's very, very common in the garden snake, it's also called. And these are going to be a great addition to your yard. I know I have one that kind of pops its head up every once in a while in my yard, and I just kind of give him a nod, and he's keeping the rat population down. He's providing food for hawks and other wildlife, and ultimately just shows me that I'm fostering a bit of an ecosystem in my neighborhood. So we want to practice tolerance with these animals. We don't want to, of course, harm them in any way. And we definitely want to reassess our predispositions of, a lot of people have adversity to snakes, but this is a non-venomous, non-harmful snake. Educate yourself on the laws that are also protecting our wildlife, because some species are protected and simply by touching them, you can be putting yourself in jeopardy. And again, tolerance of nuisance animals. So a lot of people say, like, what can I do to get rid of these moles in my yard? Well, why do we need to get rid of the moles? is the question. You know, they're aerating our soil, they're providing food again for hawks and other wildlife. And at the end of the day, the moles will probably move on. You know, a lot of these species are just going to be seasonal or temporary. And so if you have a persistent problem in your yard that is literally reoccurring throughout the year, then maybe it is looking at, you know, what's going on here. But if it's a seasonal, you know, I get questions about mushrooms. Why are there mushrooms in my yard? Well, mushrooms need to have a fruiting body to be able to disperse their spores. And so it's just allowing that part of that life cycle. The fungus is probably, the mycorrhizal fungi is probably enhancing your turf. And so allowing, you know, these things to occur. With herbivores, there's some benefits, including contributing to the food web and the circle of life. Management, we want to inhibit nets and fences. Sorry, I thought that was supposed to say nests. Prohibit nets and fences that protect fruit. So if you are really, you know, competing with a lot of birds for your peaches, then, you know, you can use mechanistic type protections. And then harassment or nest removal of non-natives. Expand the scale of the habitat. So large habitat is required for many species. Owls in particular, you know, a lot of our birds of prey require larger amounts. And so talking with your neighbors about the best management practices as it relates to wildlife is really important. And then thinking about those communal areas. So here we see a stormwater pond that has turf right up to it. How can we get together as a community and plant some plants here, enhance it for wildlife, expand those green areas, and create wildlife sanctuaries for birds and bird watching and enjoyment of the whole neighborhood. So with that, we're going to close out part 1, and I will see you back for part 2 shortly.